My parents declined to help my son with asthma, then launched a fundraiser claiming I left them. Video hook intrigue and immediate question statement, first 10 seconds. What if the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, the ones who raised you, secretly saw you as nothing more than a walking ATM, a resource to exploit? What if their selfishness cost you a life changing opportunity, and then they had the audacity to ask you for money? Story begins start establishing the scene. My name is Chloe, and if you told me a year ago that my own parents would actively help derail the one promotion that could have finally pulled me out of survival mode, I would have laughed in your face. I always knew they were a little self absorbed, maybe a bit clueless, but I honestly believe that when something truly important happened, a real crisis, they would show up. They had to. I had this picture in my head us, a slightly dysfunctional but still normal family, the kind that bickers at holidays, throws snide comments, but always comes together when it matters. I certainly didn't imagine myself sitting on the cold linoleum of my apartment floor, my son's inhaler clutched in one hand, my phone hot in the other, listening to my mother, Susan, explain why she simply could not miss a hair appointment, not even for 2 hours. Not even for the grandson she claims to adore. Not even for the promotion I'd been bleeding myself dry to get for 6 months. I've been stuck in the same mid level office job for 4 years now. It's one of those generic buildings off a busy highway, all gray carpet and humming fluorescent lights that make your eyes ache by 3 p.m. This job, it barely covers rent, daycare, groceries, and all the soul crushing random costs that come with raising a child with severe asthma in this country. My son Leo, he's in elementary school, and when I say his inhaler is basically an extra limb for us, I'm not exaggerating. His father lives states away, living his shiny new life, sending the absolute minimum support the court forced out of him, maybe a birthday card if he remembers. The rest, it's all on me. So I pick up every extra project, I stay late, I log in from home after Leo's in bed every single night. Because for months, there was this one goal, this singular light holding me together, the assistant to the executive director position, better pay, real benefits, a tiny office with a door that actually closes. The interview was set for Friday afternoon, and my boss had told me point blank, Chloe, you're my top choice. That week was supposed to be simple. Leo would go to school like usual. I'd dress a little nicer, maybe even brave mascara, then sneak out for the interview and be back at my desk before anyone in my department even finished their sad desk salads. I've run through it in my head so many times it felt like muscle memory. Then Wednesday night hit. I woke up to that sound. Every parent of a child with asthma recognizes it immediately. That wet, choking cough, somehow too loud and too weak at the same time. Leo was burning up, his chest rattling, clutching his stuffed animal, those glassy, desperate eyes that make you feel utterly useless. I spent half the night on the couch, him upright against my chest, counting his breaths, checking the clock. Doing that thing where you pretend you're calm so your kid doesn't freak out, while inside, your brain is already spiraling through every worst case scenario. By Thursday morning, it was painfully obvious Leo wasn't going to school the next day. A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach even before the pediatrician confirmed it. The doctor listened to his lungs, wrote a prescription for steroids, and told me in that infuriatingly calm voice they use not to set you off that he needed at least a couple of days of rest. I nodded, feigning a plan, but the second I walked out into the parking lot with Leo half asleep on my shoulder, my brain started to unravel. The interview was tomorrow. I couldn't possibly bring a sick child into the office, and I absolutely couldn't leave him with some random sitter he didn't know, not in the middle of a wheezing fit. I did the only thing that made sense to me in that moment of pure panic. I called my parents. They live maybe half an hour away in a comfortable mortgage free house they've owned forever, decorated with all the things they claim they can't afford but somehow always manage to buy. My father, Richard, is mostly retired, doing some part time consulting when he feels like it. My mother, Susan, doesn't work at all unless you count criticizing people on the phone as a full time job. They go out to dinner more than I do. They take little weekend trips to their place in the countryside. They post pictures of themselves clinking cocktail glasses while I'm trying to figure out if I can stretch a box of pasta for one more night. So, in my head, asking them to watch their sick grandson for maybe 2 hours on a Friday afternoon didn't feel like some monumental sacrifice. It felt like the kind of thing grandparents brag about. When Susan picked up, her voice was tinged with annoyance, like I'd interrupted some daytime TV show. I explained everything, maybe a little too fast, because I was holding Leo's hand and trying desperately not to cry in a public parking lot. I told her about the interview, how important it was, how this could finally mean not having to check my bank balance before buying cereal. I promised Leo would just need rest and his meds, that I'd have his inhaler, his favorite blanket, everything ready. I just needed them to come over for just those couple of hours. There was this long, agonizing silence on the line. So long, I thought the call had dropped. Then a heavy put upon sigh. That sound made my stomach twist into knots. She finally spoke, saying she had a hair appointment Friday afternoon that she had already rescheduled once. She launched into a monologue about how her stylist booked weeks in advance, how her roots looked terrible, how she simply couldn't cancel again, or everyone would think she was unreliable. I remember staring at the hood of my car, the words not making sense as if we were speaking completely different languages. I reminded her again, Mom, this is my shot at a promotion. This helps Leo. It's literally a 2 hour window. Her response hit me like a slap. Maybe this is a sign that you should rethink your priorities. A good mother wouldn't put work ahead of a sick child. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. The thing I wanted to scream, the raw, unfiltered truth, was not something you could ever come back from. I hung up, heart pounding, and immediately called Richard, my father. I hoped he would override her, the way he sometimes did when he thought Susan was being unreasonable. He listened, sounded distracted, then repeated almost the exact same lines about how they had plans for Friday, and it was too last minute. He said they loved their grandson, of course, but couldn't I just move the meeting? Couldn't I? I asked someone else, couldn't I just call in sick for one little day? By the time I got off the phone, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit in the car with the engine off, just breathing until I could form a full sentence again. Leo, from the back seat, asked in a small voice, Are Grandma and Grandpa coming? I forced a smile, lying through my teeth. We're still figuring it out, honey. Apparently, lying is also part of parenthood. The rest of that day became a frantic, humiliating checklist of favors. I texted every friend, every neighbor I halfway trusted, every parent from Leo's class who had ever said, Let me know if you ever need anything. People were kind, truly. But a sick kid on short notice? That's a big ask. Everyone had a reason, working out of town, juggling their own kids. I didn't blame them. But each no made the situation feel more solid, like wet cement drying around my ankles. At the office, I sent an email to my boss asking if there was any way to move the interview. He didn't answer. Someone from HR sent a polite message about the director's pack schedule and how decisions had to be finalized before the end of the week. By Thursday night, with Leo curled up on the couch, wheezing a little less but still looking utterly wrecked, I already knew how this was going to go. But I kept pretending, kept checking my phone every few minutes, half expecting Susan to call back to say she'd thought about it, that of course she would help. What was she thinking? Instead, I got a text from her complaining about the weather and asking if I'd seen some show she liked. No mention of the interview, no mention of her grandson's breathing. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, then put it face down and focused on counting Leo's breath again. That was something I could control. Friday morning, as soon as the office lines opened, I called and told them I had to withdraw from consideration. I could hear the disappointment in the assistant's voice. The way she said, Are you sure? Like I had just casually changed my mind about lunch, not had my entire life backed into a corner by a perfect storm of bad timing and family selfishness. My boss finally called me back around midday. He sounded rushed. Sorry, Chloe, but we had to keep things moving. Another candidate adjusted their schedule to make it in. He told me I was still valued, still appreciated. All those corporate comfort phrases that sound like white noise when you're holding a damp washcloth to your kid's forehead, trying not to sob into his hair. That afternoon, while Leo dozed and cartoons played quietly in the background, my phone buzzed again. A message from Susan. How did the big meeting go? She asked, all cheerful, with one of those fake excited emojis. It was like she had erased our entire conversation from the day before, or simply decided it hadn't been important. I stared at the text and felt something in me tilt, like a piece of furniture that had always been slightly wobbly, but now finally gave up and crashed to the floor. I didn't answer. I told myself I'd bring it up calmly on Sunday, when we were supposed to have dinner at their house, when everyone's blood pressure was normal. Sunday rolled around and I almost canceled. But Leo had been asking about seeing his grandparents, and I was still in that naive phase where I thought I could fix everything with one good conversation. I called Susan that morning before we drove over. I tried to explain how much it had hurt that they wouldn't help me, how everything had fallen apart because I literally had no one to lean on. She listened in total silence. When I finished, she cleared her throat and said she was sorry I was upset, but they couldn't drop everything ever. Why time I had a crisis? She said it in this icy, reasonable tone that made me feel like a teenager again, begging for a ride to a party. She reminded me that Leah was my responsibility, not hers, and that she and Richard had already done their share of parenting. I pointed out how many times I had helped them over the last few years. How I had driven over late at night when Richard twisted his knee and Susan didn't want to call an ambulance. How I had covered their electric bill once when they claimed they were short. How I had watched their dog for a whole week so they could go on a trip. She brushed it off as just what family does. Apparently, that phrase only works one way. Then, in the same breath, in the same phone call where she refused to acknowledge what she had cost me, she mentioned that things were a little tight for them this month and asked if I could help with some bills. I genuinely thought I had misheard her. I asked her to repeat it. She did, slower, like I was being dense. She said they had some credit card payments coming up and they didn't want to dip into their savings. And since I had a good job and no husband to support, maybe I could chip in a bit. I remember sitting at my tiny kitchen table, looking at the stack of envelopes. My own rent, my own utilities, the copay for Leo's last urgent care visit. I felt this weird mixture of anger and something that felt like grief. It was like realizing in real time that the people who raised you had never really seen you as a person, just as a resource. Monday morning, I got the official email from HR letting me know they had offered the position to another candidate. It was phrased politely, thanking me for my interest, like it hadn't been my own job I was trying to move up from. My boss swung by my desk later, said he was disappointed, said he had really rooted for me, but the director needed someone who could be flexible and fully available. I nodded and said I understood, because what else was I supposed to do? Scream in the middle of the office about inhalers and hair appointments and grandparents who chose their roots over their grandson's lungs. For the next few days, every time my phone buzzed and my parents' names popped up, I let it go to voicemail. They left messages not apologizing, not asking how Leo was, but circling back to money in different ways. They mentioned rising costs, retirement, unexpected home repairs. They hinted about how, in a real family, everyone helps each other. It was honestly impressive how they could say that with a straight face after leaving me to drown on the one day I had finally reached for a life raft. Eventually, Richard caught me when I forgot to let a call ring out. He did his usual routine, starting with small talk, acting confused about why I sounded distant, before steering things toward the subject he clearly cared about. He brought up some balance on a card, mentioned interest rates he didn't understand, asked if I could maybe cover a payment or two just until they got through this rough patch. When I mentioned the interview I had missed and the promotion I had lost, he made this little sympathetic noise and said something about how there would be other chances, then went right back to insisting that I had a stable income and they were struggling. That was the moment it truly clicked for me. Not just that they had let me down, but that they didn't even see it as letting me down. In their heads, I was still the kid who owed them for every meal, every ride, every roof they had ever put over my head. It didn't matter that I had a child of my own now, that I was the one packing lunches and paying for field trips and waking up at 2 a.m. to count breaths. In their twisted narrative, they were still the givers and I was still the taker, no matter how backward that actually was. After that call, I typed out a long message telling them I could not help financially anymore, not for a while, maybe not ever. I told them I needed space. I told them in very clear terms that I was still trying to climb out of the hole that missing that interview had dug for me and that I couldn't be their safety net. I deleted the message once, typed it again. My hands were shaking so much I had to brace my phone on the counter. Eventually, I hit send. I immediately felt both sick and lighter, like ripping off a bandage and seeing skin underneath that's still raw, but at least it's breathing. There were a few days of eerie quiet after that. I almost let myself hope they had actually listened, that maybe there would be some kind of self awareness moment where they realized how messed up this all was. That fantasy lasted until Susan started sending screenshots of her credit card statement. Big, scary numbers circled in red, like she was presenting evidence in some courtroom where I had been subpoenaed as the guilty party. She said she didn't know how they were going to make it, that everything on that card was for family, for me, for Leo. I stared at those numbers, at the names of stores and restaurants I recognized, and felt my jaw clench. I opened my own banking app, scrolled through old transactions, and let the memories line up next to the facts. Emergency after emergency that somehow ended in new purchases and weekend trips. It was like suddenly seeing the strings on a puppet show you had been watching your whole life without realizing it. I didn't respond to her messages, I didn't explain myself or defend myself or point out every lie. Instead, I focused on filling out job applications after Leo went to bed, on updating my resume, on writing cover letters, the pet. It made me sound confident and competent instead of barely held together with caffeine and stubbornness. I sent out more applications in 1 week than I had in the previous year. Each one was a tiny rebellion, a small step away from the version of my life where I stayed in that same desk forever because leaving felt too hard. Of course, my parents didn't stay quiet for long. When direct guilt stopped working, they upgraded to social pressure. My aunt called one evening, her voice full of concern, asking if everything was okay because Susan was so upset. She said she had heard I had cut them off and that they were on the verge of losing their house. And did I really think that was fair after everything they had done for me? I could practically hear Susan's words echoing in the background, the way she twists stories until she sounds like the one being abused. I explained as calmly as possible that my parents had not been honest, that they were not about to end up on the street, that they had refused to help me on a day that actually mattered. My aunt made the usual noises about how family is complicated and everyone makes mistakes and shouldn't I just sit down with them and talk it through. I told her I had tried talking. I had begged, actually. They just preferred their version of events where I was the villain. She didn't have a response to that. She just sighed and said she would pray for us, which is basically code in my family for I'm not going to challenge the people actually causing harm, but I'm going to act like it's all in the hands of the universe now. Things reached a different level the day Richard showed up at the park where Leo and I were spending a rare, calm afternoon. I was pushing my son on the swing with one hand, sipping lukewarm coffee with the other, when I saw my parents' car pull into the lot. My stomach dropped so fast I felt dizzy. Richard got out with that big smile he uses in public, the one that makes people think he's this warm, easygoing guy. Leo squealed and waved, because he still loves them, because he doesn't understand any of this. Richard hugged him, swung him around once, then asked if he could talk to me alone for a second. He gestured toward a picnic table a few yards away, leaving Leo within eyesight, but still close enough to hear the swings creaking. He started in on how Susan wasn't sleeping, how she cried every night, how she didn't understand why I was punishing them. He sprinkled in phrases like golden years and fixed income and pressure as if I were some faceless collection agency instead of their daughter. When I asked him why they could drive all the way to the park unannounced to corner me like this, but couldn't drive to my apartment to sit with their grandson for 2 hours so I could try to get a better job, he didn't have an answer that made sense. He sort of shrugged, said it had been a busy week, that Susan had her appointment, that they had already made plans. Plans apparently outrank a sick child and a career opportunity, but don't outrank a guilt trip road trip. Later that week, my brother Daniel called. Daniel and I aren't especially close, partly because we've both been busy surviving our own lives, partly because our parents have always played us off each other in that subtle way that keeps kids second guessing each other. He told me very quietly that our parents had pulled a similar stunt with him the previous year. They had begged him for money for an urgent plumbing disaster, made it sound like their house was about to be condemned, only for him to find out later that the so-called emergency had somehow ended in a fully redecorated living room. He said he wished he had warned me sooner, but it's hard to warn someone about something you're still trying to process yourself. Hearing that didn't make me feel better, exactly, but it helped something click into place. This wasn't one bad decision from them. This was a pattern. I just hadn't wanted to see it because seeing it meant admitting that the people I kept hoping would change had actually been the same for a very long time. In the middle of all that mess, I got an email from a smaller company across town inviting me to interview for an administrative position with better pay and more flexibility. The timing was almost painful. Part of me wanted to turn it down out of pure fear that the universe was about to play the same twisted joke on me again. Another part of me knew that if I let my parents' sabotage scare me away from every chance, I would still be sitting at that same desk when Leo graduated high school. I lined up childcare properly this time. I talked to a neighbor I trust, a woman who had watched Leo before for shorter stretches and who understood his asthma routine. I paid her because I've learned that when people say, let me know if you need anything, sometimes what that actually means is hire me and don't feel guilty about it. I didn't mention the interview to my parents at all. I didn't want to give them information they could weaponize. Of course, they still found ways to make everything about them. Susan started sending these long, emotionally loaded messages about how disappointed she was in me, how she never imagined raising a daughter who would turn her back on her parents. In the same breath, she would mention a lingering balance on the card and how a small contribution would really show that I still cared. I checked their social media one night because I'm not above that kind of self-harm, apparently. And there they were, smiling at some fancy-looking restaurant with friends Susan in a dress I had never seen before. The caption talked about living life to the fullest, gratitude, all those cheesy phrases people slap under pictures of expensive cocktails. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Instead, I put it down, went back to practicing answers to interview questions in the mirror, and tried not to think about the fact that my parents were literally asking me to pay for a lifestyle they clearly had no intention of giving up. The night before the interview, there was a knock on my apartment door a little after 8 p.m. I was in sweatpants, Leo was in pajamas, and we were halfway through a movie for the third time because sick kids like repetition. I opened the door and found Susan standing there in a nice coat, makeup still on, like she had just come from another dinner out. She didn't text first, didn't call, just appeared the way she always used to walk into my place when I first moved out because she had a spare key and no concept of boundaries. She stayed in the hallway when I didn't step aside, delivering her usual speech about being desperate and drowning, but getting vague the second I asked for specifics. She kept circling back to the credit card, to interest, to how unfair it all was. When I pointed out that the card seemed to cover a lot of dinners and trips and gifts for herself, she changed the subject. I told her as calmly as I could that I couldn't help, that I had an interview in the morning I was focusing on, that I needed to take care of Leo and myself first for once. She stared at me like I had grown a second head. She said something about me being ungrateful, how I wouldn't even be in this country without them, which was a wild thing to say considering we are all from here, but that's how their logic works. I took a deep breath, said goodnight, and closed the door. She stayed on the other side for a full me. Knew maybe two, long enough for my heart to pound loud enough for Leo to ask from the couch if everything was okay. The interview went well. Better than well, actually. The manager was kind, straightforward, seemed genuinely impressed with my experience. They talked about flexible hours, partly remote work, health benefits that sounded like something out of a dream to someone who has had to argue with billing departments over every inhaler. I walked out of that office a little dazed, like maybe the universe wasn't completely against me after all. The very next day, before I had even heard back officially, my parents escalated. They created one of those fundraising pages online and blasted the link out to what felt like every relative we have. The description was vague and emotional, all about unexpected medical issues and financial hardship. There was no mention of the dinners, the trips, the shopping. There was definitely no mention of refusing to help their daughter on the day she needed them. It was all about them being poor, sick, abandoned by their ungrateful children. My phone lit up with notifications as cousins and old family friends shared the link, commented with heart emojis and prayers. Daniel called me, sounding furious and exhausted because, of course, they hadn't told him this was coming either. We both stared at the page at the target amount that was way higher than whatever credit card screenshot Susan had sent me. He left a cautious comment asking what exactly the funds were for and whether there was any documentation, trying to keep it civil. The comment disappeared within an hour. Susan then posted something about how it's heartbreaking when your own children attack you in public instead of standing with you. Over the next few days, the fundraiser started to crack under its own weight. A couple of my cousins, the ones I had messaged privately, began asking polite but pointed questions in the comments. They wanted to know what exactly the medical emergency was, which hospital, what kind of treatment. They asked if my parents could share any documentation so people knew their donations were going to the right place. Susan tried to answer vaguely, hiding behind words like privacy and dignity, but the questions kept coming and the answers didn't get any clearer. Then my aunt, the one who had been housing them in her guest room, left a comment that was professional but devastating. She mentioned that she had recently accompanied my parents to a financial meeting and that while things were tight, there was a payment plan in place and no immediate crisis. She suggested that anyone concerned should reach out to my parents directly for specifics before donating. Within hours, the fundraiser was gone. No explanation, no update, just deleted like it had never existed. A few relatives reached out to me privately after that. Some apologized for believing the story without question. Others said they had suspected something was off but didn't want to cause drama. One cousin, someone I barely knew, sent me a message saying she had been through something similar with her own parents and that she was proud of me for standing my ground. It didn't erase the humiliation of seeing that page in the first place, but it helped to know that at least some people could see through the performance. I typed out at least 3 different versions of a response. One was brutally honest, one was just a link to their dinner photo with a question mark. One was a long explanation of everything that had happened with my promotion, Leo, the bills. I deleted all of them. In the end, I sent private messages to a couple of relatives I actually trust, suggesting they ask my parents for specific details and paperwork before donating. I said there had been some inconsistencies and left it at that. I figured if people wanted to see the truth, they would follow the breadcrumbs. The offer from the new job came through 2 days later. The salary was higher than what the promotion I had missed would have given me. The benefits were better. The schedule included the possibility of working from home when Leo was sick. It felt like someone had finally cracked a window in a room I had been suffocating in. I accepted on the spot, then took Leo out for ice cream that dripped all over his shirt, and I didn't even care because for once the mess around me felt like the good kind. Of course, the drama with my parents didn't magically disappear just because I was climbing onto a different rung of the ladder. One afternoon, not long after I had started the new job, I got a call from the management office of my apartment complex. The woman on the line was polite but confused, asking if my parents were authorized to enter my unit without me being there. Apparently, they had showed up at the front desk saying they had lost their key and needed to drop off some urgent medication for their grandson. They didn't have a key card on file, obviously, because I had never put them on the lease. The staff followed the rules and refused them access, but they wanted to double check that this was correct. I felt my skin go cold. I told the manager that my parents did not have permission to enter my apartment, that there was no medication, that they should not be let in under any circumstances unless I was there. Then I hung up and drove home with my heart pounding because the image of them trying to get into my place while I was gone hit some deep, terrified nerve. When I pulled into the parking lot, their car was there, parked crooked, like they had been waiting to ambush me again. They were in the lobby, Susan Paul. Singing and Richard sitting with his arms crossed. As soon as they saw me, Susan launched into this frantic explanation about how their utilities had been shut off and they had nowhere to go, and how the only logical solution was for them to stay with me for a while. She painted this picture of them shivering in a dark house with no running water or heat, which might have been more convincing if I hadn't seen her new dress in a photo from a night out literally days earlier. I didn't let them inside the building. I stepped back, kept the glass door between us, and asked questions. When had the utilities been cut? Had they contacted the companies? What payment plans had they asked for? Every question made Susan's story wobble a little more. She fell back on dramatics, on tears, on accusing me of not caring if they lived or died. Richard chimed in with comments about how they never thought their child would abandon them in their time of need. They tried again a few days later, this time going back to the management office to ask if they could be added as permanent guests or whatever label would let them pop by whenever they wanted. The staff told them building policy didn't allow adding people without the leaseholder's written consent. Susan apparently got loud, insisting she was just trying to bring medicine for her poor, neglected grandson. The manager noted it all and then called me again, sounding annoyed on my behalf. The worst was the night they showed up at my actual door with suitcases. Not just a bag or two, but real luggage, the kind you bring when you're planning to stay more than a night. They knocked and knocked until I finally opened the door as far as the chain would let it. Leo peeked around my legs, recognizing their voices. Susan did the same script, no place to go, homeless. Everyone else had turned their backs on them, and apparently I was Will. And to do the same, she tried to step forward, but I kept the chain latched. I went out into the hallway, closing the door almost all the way behind me so Leo couldn't hear everything. Susan's eyes were shining with tears, but there was this sharpness behind them that I recognized. She's very good at turning her emotions on and off depending on who's watching. She told me that if I refused to let them in, they might have to involve the authorities, because surely the police would see how cruel it was for a daughter to leave her elderly parents with nowhere to sleep. My heart was racing so hard I could feel every beat in my throat. Part of me wanted to crumble, to give in just to avoid the chaos and the embarrassment of a scene in the hallway. Another part of me, the part that had been slowly waking up since that missed interview, stayed steady. I told her, my voice shaking but still clear, that they had options. They had a car, they had credit cards, they had relatives who had already opened their home to them. They had created this crisis, and they didn't get to solve it by shoving it onto me and my kid. They didn't call the police. I honestly don't think they ever planned to. The threat was just one more weapon in their manipulation arsenal. Eventually, they left, stomping down the stairs, loud enough for my downstairs neighbor to text me asking if everything was okay. I lied and said we had just had a family disagreement. It felt too weird to type out the truth, that my parents had tried to move into my one-bedroom apartment by force. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Richard. It was a list, an actual typed out list of every expense they claimed to have had for me since I was born. Hospital bills, school supplies, braces, prom dresses, all of it, each one with an imaginary dollar amount next to it. At the bottom, there was a total that meant in real terms, but was clearly supposed to shame me. The subject line was something about balance due, as if parenthood were a loan I was now being called to repay with interest. I stared at that email for a long time. I laughed once, this short, hysterical laugh that startled Leo in the next room. Then I cried, the ugly, silent kind where your whole body shakes. Then I took a screenshot and sent it to my therapist because, yes, I finally got one of those thanks to the new job's insurance. It took me that long to admit that whatever had been happening in my family, my whole life was not just regular family drama. It was a pattern of manipulation so deep that I had been drowning in it without even seeing the water. Therapy helped me put words to things I had always felt. It helped me see that saying no to my parents was not cruel, it was self-preservation. It helped me build boundaries that didn't crumble at the first sign of guilt. With my therapist's help, I also realized I needed more physical space. So, a few months into the new job, after a lot of budgeting and a small miracle in the form of a move-in special, I upgraded to a 2-bedroom apartment in the same school district. Leo got his own room for the first time in his life. Watching him fall asleep under his own posters with his own little lamp on his own little nightstand made every panic attack I had during that move feel worth it. My parents, of course, treated the move as a personal attack as if I had done it just to spite them. They heard about it through the family grapevine, not from me, because by then I had blocked them on most platforms and kept communication to a bare minimum. They told anyone who would listen that I had moved to keep them from visiting, that I was poisoning their grandson against them, that I was ungrateful for everything they'd ever done. Around that time, they try. At a different angle that scared me more than anything they had done so far, one afternoon I got a call from the front office of Leo's school. The secretary sounded a little flustered, asking if I had authorized my parents to pick him up early for a doctor's appointment. My heart practically stopped. I told her absolutely not, that there was no appointment, that my parents were not allowed to take him anywhere. She put me on hold, then came back and confirmed that he was still in his classroom, that they had not let anyone sign him out. They had called me because something about Susan's story had not quite added up. Apparently, my parents had marched into the school office, acting as if it was totally normal to pull a kid out without notice. They used the fact that they were still listed as emergency contacts from years ago. They spun some vague story about a same day medical thing that needed attention. The staff, bless them, had enough sense to double check, and that call probably prevented a scene I don't even want to picture. I hung up with the school and immediately drove there, shaking so hard I had to park and breathe for a minute before going inside. I updated every form they had, removing my parents as contacts entirely, adding my neighbor and Daniel instead. The principal met with me and listened as I explained the situation, at least the parts I could explain without sounding completely unhinged. She was kind, professional, and clear that they would not release Leo to anyone not explicitly approved by me. I walked out of that building with a mixture of relief and this sick, hollow feeling that my own parents had tried to go around me to get to my child. That night, my parents called nonstop. I didn't just let the calls go to voicemail. I sat in my car outside a police station for a good 20 minutes, hand shaking on the steering wheel, trying to deck, idea if I was overreacting or finally reacting appropriately for once in my life. When I finally went inside and talked to an officer, he was kind but realistic. He explained that because the school had stopped my parents and Leo was safe, it would be hard to push anything criminal right then, but he helped me file a report anyway, so there would be a paper trail. He suggested that if they tried anything like that again, I should look into a restraining order. I walked out with a little card that had a case number written on it. I still keep it in my wallet. That tiny rectangle of paper felt like both a shield and a punch to the gut, proof that my own parents had officially crossed a line I could not pretend away anymore. The calls and messages that night swung from outraged to wounded to manipulative and back again. They accused me of trying to turn Leo against them, of being cruel, unstable, vindictive. Susan shouted in one voicemail that I had embarrassed her at the school by making it seem like she was some kind of predator. It didn't seem to register with her that walking into a school and trying to remove a child without his parents' permission is exactly the kind of thing that makes you look like one. My aunt, who had been housing them on and off in her guest room, finally hit her limit and called me one evening after dinner. She sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. She told me that my parents had not been honest about their financial situation with her either. They had refinanced their house years ago, taken out money they never mentioned, and then fallen behind on payments because they kept overspending on things that had nothing to do with survival. She had gone with them to a meeting at the bank and learned that they had worked out a manageable payment plan. They were not and had never been at risk of being thrown out on the street. I just didn't like the idea of cutting back on their lifestyle. When I told her about the school incident, the case number, and the conversation with the police, I watched her face go pale. She said very quietly that she had not realized it had gotten that serious. Neither had I until it did. Hearing that shouldn't have shocked me at that point, but it still did. It confirmed what my gut had been screaming for months. There had never been a real emergency. Every time they had talked about being desperate, it had been about preserving comfort, not avoiding disaster. They had wanted me, their daughter, who was scraping together coins to pay for inhalers and field trips to help fund their dinners and their trips and their impulse buys. And when I finally said no, they turned me into the villain in their story. There were still moments that made all of this harder than I expected. Leo's birthday was one of them. He turned 8 that year, and all he wanted was a party at the little bowling alley near our apartment with a few of his friends from school. I booked the lane, ordered the sad pizza they serve at those places, bought a packet of balloons I was too lazy to blow up evenly. The night before, he asked in that small, hopeful voice if his grandparents were going to come. I had been dreading that question for weeks. I told him gently that they wouldn't be there. I explained that there were some grown up problems happening, that it had nothing to do with him, that they loved him in their own way, but that it was my job to keep him safe, and that sometimes meant limiting how much we saw people, even family. His face fell for a second, and I swear that tiny flicker of disappointment hurt more than any email or voicemail or fundraiser link ever could. Then he nodded, took a breath, and asked if his favorite friend from class would definitely be there because that was what really mattered to him in that moment. The party went fine, kids bowled badly, spilled soda, screamed over each other, all the usual chaos. I smiled and cheered and took pictures and pretended my heart wasn't breaking every time I saw a grandparent helping a kid pick up a ball that was too heavy. Later that night, after Leo was asleep, surrounded by new toys and crumpled wrapping paper, I sat on the couch and let myself finally feel all of it. The anger, the grief, the weird sense of relief that he was surrounded by people who actually showed up. Several months after the school incident, after the hallway confrontation, after the fundraising drama, Richard called again. This time, his voice sounded different, less sharp, more careful. He told me Susan had started seeing a therapist after a scare with her blood pressure. He said she had been forced to admit that maybe, just maybe, some of her behavior had pushed us away. He threw around phrases like personal growth and working on herself, clearly words he had picked up from her sessions. He also, in a very casual tone, mentioned that they had met with a financial advisor and set up automatic payments for their mortgage and utilities. Like, that was some huge accomplishment. I almost commented that most people set those up the minute they move into a place, but I bit my tongue. He slipped in a comment about how therapy had made Susan see that relationships are a two-way street and that maybe if I did some work on myself too, we could all meet in the middle. That part made my jaw clench. I told him I was glad, genuinely glad, that Susan was finally talking to someone who was not a relative she could bully into agreement. I said I hoped they stuck with the financial plan. I also told him as clearly as I could that none of that changed the boundaries I had put in place. I said I was willing to extra. Nage occasional emails with them, maybe send pictures of Leo, maybe read updates about their health, but that was it. No surprise visits, no keys, no picking him up from school, no money. If they wanted more than that, they were going to have to prove over a long period of time that they were capable of respecting me as a parent and as a person, not just as a walking wallet. He didn't like hearing that. He tried to argue, to guilt, to reminisce about when I was little and how close we had been. I let him talk, let him try every trick in the book, and then repeated the same boundary again. It felt repetitive, robotic almost, but that's what boundaries are when you're used to having none. They are boring and firm and not up for debate, and they make people who are used to steamrolling you very uncomfortable. So that is where things are now. I have a better job. I have a slightly bigger apartment with a second bedroom that still makes me tear up sometimes when I tuck Leo in. I have a therapist who helps me untangle the knots in my brain so I don't automatically feel like a monster every time I don't answer a call from my parents. Leo is doing okay. He still gets sick sometimes, and I still carry his inhaler like it is sacred, but I no longer feel like one missed shift or one surprise bill is going to bring everything crashing down the way it used to. My parents are still out there, still telling their version of the story to anyone who will listen. In their version, I am cold, selfish, obsessed with money, trying to erase them from my life. In mine, I am a woman who finally realized that love without respect and basic support is not actually love. It is control with a nicer label. I am not pretending it doesn't hurt. It does every holiday, every school event where I sign the grandparent line with a dash. Every random Tuesday when I catch myself reaching for my phone. T. Oh, share a funny thing, Leo said before remembering that sharing it would mean opening a door I worked so hard to close. But I also know this, the night Leo needed me, and my boss needed me, and my parents chose their own convenience over both, something in me snapped into focus. I saw my life and my family clearly for the first time. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. No matter how many fundraising links and guilt-soaked voicemails and tearful hallway confrontations people throw at you, you can only decide what to do with that clarity. Right now, what I am doing is this. I am going to work, paying my bills, packing lunches, attending school conferences, standing in line at the store, all the boring little things that make up a life. I am answering Leo's questions as honestly as I can without dumping adult weight on his shoulders. I am letting myself enjoy the quiet moments without waiting for the other shoe to drop every second. And I am holding my boundaries even when my hands shake. Maybe someday there will be a version of our family where my parents can sit in my living room, drink coffee, and listen to Leo talk about his day without turning it into a performance about how hard their lives are. Maybe Susan will look at me and see an adult instead of a walking debt. Maybe Richard will apologize without adding a list of excuses. Or maybe none of that will happen. Maybe the distance and the awkward emails and the missing names on birthday invitations, is as good as it will ever get. Either way, I am not going back to the version of my life where their wants automatically outrank my needs. I've spent enough nights sitting in parking lots outside pediatrician offices, staring at my phone, waiting for parents who were never going to show up for me. I am done waiting. I am here with my kid, building something that looks suspiciously like stable, itty out of the chaos they left behind, and if that makes me the villain in their story, then fine. I have finally decided I'm allowed to be the hero in mine, even if no one in my family ever calls it that out loud. I used to think that setting boundaries would feel like slamming doors, like constant dramatic scenes of me yelling and storming out. But most of it has actually been boring and repetitive in a way that would make terrible television. It looks like not replying to the fifth guilt soaked text in a row. It looks like sending a short email instead of picking up a call when I'm already shaking. It looks like telling school staff over and over again that no, those people are not allowed to pick up my kid, even if they swear they're family. It looks like preparing myself before holidays, deciding ahead of time what I am willing to do and what I am not, and then sticking to it even when the group messages start filling up with dramatic sentences and half truths. There was this one holiday season that really drove the point home for me. My aunt decided to host dinner because apparently she thought neutral territory would make everyone behave. Daniel and I agreed to go for a few hours, mostly so Leo could see cousins and play with someone who didn't need an inhaler break every 10 minutes. I made it very clear through my aunt that if my parents started anything, I would leave. No scenes, no arguments. I would just quietly pick up my kid and go. Walking into that house felt like walking into a familiar minefield. Every corner hiding a memory of some past explosion. Susan tried to act like nothing had happened. She greeted me with that overly bright smile, arms wide, full of perfume and tension. I let her hug me briefly because Leo was watching, but I didn't fall into the old rhythm of letting her steer the conversation. She made little comments all evening, small d. Eggs about how thin I looked, how tired, how being a single mother must be so hard, how maybe if I were more forgiving, my life would be easier. Richard contributed his usual quiet martyr act, telling stories about the so called good old days when we were a close family, conveniently skipping over all the times they had used us as their personal safety net. At one point, Susan cornered me near the sink while I was rinsing plates. She lowered her voice and said she had been talking to her therapist about me. That sentence alone almost made me drop a plate. She said her therapist thought I was being unfair, that I was too rigid, that I was going to end up alone if I kept pushing people away. I asked, maybe a little sharper than I intended, if her therapist had heard the full story or just the edited version where my parents were noble heroes and I was a selfish villain. She didn't answer that. She just sniffed and said she hoped I could forgive them someday, as if they had already apologized and done the work, as if surrender on my end was the only piece missing. I felt that familiar rush of heat in my face, the one that used to precede me, snapping, crying, begging, or all three. Only this time, instead of exploding, I took a breath and stuck to what my therapist and I had rehearsed. I told Susan in a low voice that I was not discussing any of that at a holiday dinner, that if she wanted to have a real conversation, she could email me and I would decide if and when I had the energy to respond. Then I dried my hands, walked away, and sat on the floor to help Leo assemble a toy someone had given him. It sounds small, but for me it was huge. Because the old me would have stayed in that kitchen until I had been talked into a corner. Later that night, after we left early and Leo fell asleep in the car with a smear of chocolate on his cheek, my phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from Susan about how rude I had been, about how I had embarrassed her in front of the family, about how other mothers would kill to have grandparents so involved and I was throwing that away. In the past, those words would have cut right through me. This time, they still hurt. I'm not going to pretend they didn't, but there was also this new layer of calm over everything. I reminded myself that involvement is not automatically good if it comes with strings and knives hidden inside compliments. Therapy hasn't turned me into some perfect Zen version of myself. There were sessions where my therapist gently pointed out that I had gone from letting my parents walk all over me to slamming every door at once, including ones that didn't need to be welded shut. Like the time I snapped at Daniel for being 5 minutes late because my nervous system had been so rewired that any lateness felt like betrayal. One session stands out. I was mid rant about my parents when my therapist leaned in and asked whose voice it was telling me that taking time off work made me weak. Mine or theirs? I stopped cold. She pointed out that I had spent my whole life being told my needs were less important than someone else's. So, of course, I was still acting that way even when my boss had given me permission to have boundaries. Changing that narrator is slow. It looks like emailing my boss about leaving early for a school event without apologizing 10 times. It looks like saying no to extra projects and sitting with the discomfort instead of overcompensating. My relationship with Daniel has changed too. We talk more now in a quieter, more honest way. He comes over with snacks and sits on my couch while our kids play, and we swap stories about growing up in a house where everything was a favor owed. He told me once that he used to think I was a favorite because our mother called me first for everything. I laughed so hard I nearly choked because, from my perspective, he was the golden child who got away earlier, who set boundaries first, who moved just far enough away that our parents couldn't pop in without notice. We compared notes and realized that our parents had been running the same playbook on both of us, just with slightly different scripts. If he said no, they would sigh and say, "Well, we can always ask your sister. She's more reliable." If I hesitated, they would shake their heads and say, "Your brother would never leave us hanging like this." It was divide and conquer dressed up as concern. No wonder it took us this long to really talk. There are still days when I miss the idea of parents more than the actual people, like when Leo lost his first tooth and was so proud he made me take a blurry picture from every angle, or when I got the first pay stub from my new job and realized that for the first time in a long time, there was a tiny bit of breathing room in my budget. I had this sudden urge to call Susan and say, "Look, I did it. I'm okay." But I know how that call would go. It would start with congratulations and end with hints about how much easier their life would be if I could help a little now that I was doing better. So instead, I celebrate in smaller ways. I took Leo out for a cheap burger and fries after that first payday and let him get the milkshake too. I bought myself a pair of jeans that actually fit instead of whatever was on clearance in the wrong size. I started a tiny savings account, abled emergency, that is actually for me and my kid, not for someone else's overdue card. Every time I transfer a little money into that account, it feels like another break in a wall between my life and the chaos my parents still choose. Sometimes I worry that I'm being too harsh, that I'm overcorrecting, that maybe if I had handled things differently, we could have landed in some softer place where they visit occasionally, and I don't flinch every time my phone rings. Then I remember the sound of Leo's cough that night. The way Susan talked about her hair appointment like it was a natural disaster. The way Richard acted like missing a career opportunity was no big deal. I remember them trying to walk into my apartment without permission, trying to walk into my kid's school without my consent. I remember that fundraiser, that list of invented debts, that email that felt like an invoice for my own existence. Those memories are not there so I can keep nursing anger forever. They are there so I do not gaslight myself into pretending it was not that bad, because that is the dangerous thing about time. It softens the edges of memories, makes you question your own reactions. It makes you wonder if maybe you overreacted, if maybe you should have kept swallowing everything down. Having the full story laid out in my head like a file I can open when I start doubting keeps me grounded. If there is one thing I hope Leo learns from all this, it is that love is not supposed to feel like obligation with a pretty bow on top. I tell him often that he doesn't owe me for food or shelter or clothes. Those are my job as his parent. He owes me basic respect because I am a human being, not because I changed his diapers, and I try really hard to show him that respect goes both ways. When I mess up, I apologize, even when my pride screams otherwise. When I am too sharp with him because I am stressed, I own it instead of blaming him for making me angry. He will grow up and form his own opinions about all of this. Maybe one day he will read old messages or hear stories and decide I was too strict or not strict enough. Maybe he will have his own version of this kind of late night vent someday. Hopefully, not about me. But let's be honest, none of us gets out of this whole parenting thing spotless. All I can do is try to break the pattern that says children are born owing their parents a lifetime debt. I am not pretending I have this all figured out. There are still hard days, but the difference now is that when those moments of doubt come, I have something to measure them against. The sound of Leo's breathing that night, Susan's voice on the phone choosing her hair appointment, Richard's shrug at the park when I asked why plans outranked a sick child. Those memories don't exist to keep me angry forever. They exist to keep me from gaslighting myself into thinking it was not that bad. Last week, Leo came home from school with a permission slip for a field trip. It was the kind that needed a signature and a small fee, nothing major. He handed it to me and said, casual as anything, that I shouldn't worry because he knew I would handle it. It was such a small moment, barely worth remembering on its own, but it hit me hard. He didn't ask if we could afford it. He didn't apologize for needing something. He just trusted that I would figure it out because that's what I do. I signed the form that night and put the cash in an envelope. The next morning, I watched him run to the bus with his backpack bouncing, permission slip safely tucked inside, and I realized that this right here is what I was fighting for that whole time. Not some big dramatic victory, not a tearful family reunion where everyone apologizes and learns a lesson, just this. A kid who feels secure enough to ask for what he needs without carrying the weight of whether his parent can handle it. My parents are still out there, still telling their version of the story where I am the villain. Maybe someday there will be room for something different, maybe not. Either way, I am here packing lunches, signing permission slips, showing up to parent teacher conferences, building something that looks like stability out of the chaos they left behind. And if that makes me the bad guy in their story, I can live with that. Because in this story, the one that actually matters, I am the one who showed up. Conclusion and call to action. It's a complicated journey, and I know I'm not the only one. Have you ever had to choose between your own well being and the constant demands of family who just wouldn't see you for who you are? How did you find your way out of that dynamic? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one.